Amara had always been the quiet one in her home. She lived in Ibadan with her father, a man who once adored her but now seemed to shrink into silence, and her stepmother Titi, whose presence carried nothing but cruelty. For years, Amara endured in silence, cooking, cleaning, and serving like a stranger in her own father's house. Her smiles faded, her voice grew softer, yet her heart still carried kindness. But that evening, the walls of the house shook with anger. Titi's voice thundered through the rooms as she accused Amara of disrespect, of being ungrateful, of being a burden. Amara tried to defend herself, her words trembling but steady, refusing for once to remain silent. That tiny spark of courage only fueled Titi's rage. "Don't you dare talk back to me," Titi shouted, her eyes burning with hate. She stepped closer, her face twisted in anger. Amara, standing at the top of the staircase, felt her chest tighten, fear rising in her throat. She looked toward her father, hoping, just hoping for him to say something. But he only lowered his gaze, trapped in Titi's shadow. Then it happened. In a flash of fury, Titi's hands shoved Amara hard. The world tilted. The staircase swallowed her body, step after step, until she hit the floor with a sickening thud. Pain shot through her like fire, and then silence. Darkness wrapped around her, heavy and endless. Her last thought before everything faded was simple: maybe this is how my story ends. Amara opened her eyes to a blur of white walls and the steady beeping of machines. The sharp smell of medicine filled the air. Her head throbbed, and her body felt like it was no longer her own. She tried to move, but pain shot through her legs, forcing her to gasp. Nurses rushed in, adjusting tubes and checking the machines as if her life was hanging by a thread. She heard doctors whispering outside her room. Their voices were low, but the words still found her ears. "Her spinal injury is serious. There's a chance she may never walk again." The words stabbed at her heart, echoing louder than the machines around her. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a bad dream, wishing she could wake up back in her room before the fall. Soon Titi walked in. Her face carried a mask of concern as she clutched Amara's hand, squeezing it gently for the watching nurses. "My poor child," she said softly, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. But when the room grew quiet and no one was looking, her lips curled into a cruel smile. Her eyes glimmered not with worry but with victory. To her, Amara was finished, a broken girl who would never rise again. Amara's father entered the room later, standing at the door like a shadow. His eyes were heavy, his hands shaking slightly, but he said nothing. He neither comforted his daughter nor confronted his wife. His silence was louder than any word he could have spoken. Amara searched his face, begging for some sign that he cared, but he looked away, swallowed whole by Titi's control. At night, alone with the machines, tears rolled down Amara's cheeks. She thought about all the years she had endured, the insults, the chores, the loneliness. And now, as if the world had decided to break her completely, she lay trapped in a body that might never walk again. Every whisper of the doctors returned to her, each one heavier than the last. But even in her pain, a small voice inside her refused to die. It whispered to her in the silence, telling her she was more than her suffering, more than the cruelty around her. Yet the voice was faint, almost drowned by the sound of Titi's false kindness and her father's heavy silence. As she drifted back to sleep, one thought lingered in her heart: if this is not the end of me, then something inside me must learn to fight. Lying in the hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling, Amara's mind began to wander. Her body was too weak to move, but her thoughts carried her back to the life she had been living long before the fall. Every memory came like sharp glass, cutting deeper than her physical wounds. She remembered mornings when she was the first awake, cleaning the entire house while her stepmother, Titi, sat comfortably, sipping tea and giving out orders as if Amara were nothing more than a maid. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, cooked meals she was never allowed to enjoy fully, and washed clothes until her fingers were sore. By the time she finished, her stepmother's children ate first, leaving only scraps for her. Amara would sit quietly at the corner of the table, eating cold leftovers, pretending she was full so no one would notice her hunger. Her father was always there, yet it felt as though he wasn't. She remembered looking at him with pleading eyes, waiting for him to speak up, to shield her, to at least acknowledge the pain she was in. But every time he remained silent. He looked away, as though her suffering was invisible. His silence hurt more than Titi's words. A father's love should have been her shelter, but instead, it felt like a locked door she could never open. She remembered the laughter too, not her own, but the cruel laughter of her stepmother whenever Amara's tears fell. The sound of it still echoed in her ears. It was a laughter that told her she was unwanted, that she didn't belong, that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough. Those nights she cried herself to sleep, whispering prayers into her pillow, begging for freedom, begging for someone to see her worth. And now, as she lay bedridden, unable to move her legs, those memories pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. For a moment, she felt small again, helpless and broken. But then something shifted. She thought of all the times she had survived the humiliation, the hunger, the loneliness. She had endured it all, even when no one stood by her side. If she could survive those years of silent suffering, then maybe, just maybe, this accident would not be the end of her. Tears filled her eyes, not of weakness but of fire. Every insult, every slap of rejection, every moment her father looked away, they were no longer weights holding her down. They became fuel. She whispered softly to herself, her voice trembling but steady. I won't let this be the end. I won't let them win. Her body was broken, but inside her, something new was awakening, something stronger. The days in the hospital felt endless for Amara. Morning blended into night, and every time she opened her eyes, the same white ceiling stared back at her. The doctors came and went, their words heavy with doubt. The nurses were kind, but their pity-filled glances cut deep into her heart. Amara began to wonder if life had truly ended for her the night she fell down those stairs. Then one morning, a new face appeared in her room. He was tall, with a calm but determined look in his eyes. His name was Obi, a young physical therapist assigned to help her. Unlike the others, he did not look at her with pity. He pulled a chair close to her bed and said, I know you feel broken, but I also know there's more strength in you than you think. Amara looked at him, uncertain. They said I may never walk again, she whispered. Obi shook his head gently. Doctors measure bones and muscles. But they can't measure your will. Don't let them win by giving up. Not your stepmother, not the pain, not the fear. If you fight, you'll rise. Those words planted a small seed in Amara's heart. The next day, Obi began her therapy. The first time he asked her to try moving her legs, the pain was unbearable. Tears ran down her face as she tried and failed. I can't, she cried. But Obi didn't let go. Yes, you can. Even if it's 1 inch today, it will be 2 inches tomorrow. Every step is a victory. Day after day he returned. Some days Amara wanted to give up, to sink into her bed and let life pass her by. But Obi's steady voice pulled her back. He never raised his tone, but his words carried power. You're not weak, Amara. They want you to believe that, but I see the fire in you. Weeks passed. What once felt impossible slowly became possible. The first time her legs trembled under her weight, she felt a surge of hope. The hospital hallway became her battlefield, her hands gripping the walker, her breath shaky, her body screaming in pain. Obi walked beside her, close enough to catch her if she fell. And every time she managed a step, he whispered, Look at you. You're doing it. This is how you win. The day Amara stood without the walker, even if only for a moment, she felt tears stream down her face. It wasn't just about walking. It was about proving to herself that she was not finished, that her story was still being written. For the first time in years, Amara felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. The hospital became Amara's second home. Between the endless therapy sessions and the long, quiet nights, she often felt trapped in her own thoughts. Her body was healing slowly, but her heart still carried scars no medicine could touch. She needed something to hold on to, something that reminded her she was still alive beyond the pain. One afternoon, while waiting for Obi to arrive for her therapy, Amara found an old pen on the bedside table. Out of boredom, she pulled a sheet from the hospital notepad and began to draw. First, it was nothing, just random lines and shapes. But soon, Her hand moved with a kind of freedom she had never felt before. Without planning it, she sketched a face. Tired, sad, but filled with strength. It was her own reflection, her own story on paper. From that day she couldn't stop. Whenever her body ached and walking felt impossible, she turned to sketching. If there was no paper, she drew on tissues, napkins, even the corners of her hospital sheets. Each stroke carried her pain. Each line told a part of her story. The nurses who passed by began to notice. They would pause, watching quietly as Amara's sadness turned into something beautiful through her hands. One nurse, Chioma, was particularly moved. One evening, she picked up a sketch of a broken staircase that turned into wings. This is powerful," Chioma whispered. Amara only smiled shyly, embarrassed. But Chioma wasn't done. She took a photo of the drawing and, without telling Amara, shared it on her social media. By the next morning, everything had changed. Chioma rushed into Amara's room, her phone buzzing non-stop. "Amara, you won't believe this," she said breathlessly, showing her the screen. Thousands of people had shared the picture. Comments poured in. "Who made this? This speaks to my soul. Please tell us more about the artist." Amara's heart raced. She had never thought her drawings meant anything to anyone. To her, they were just a way of breathing through the pain. Yet here were strangers, people she had never met, calling her an artist, praising her for a talent she didn't even know she had. First, she felt unworthy. She was just a girl who had been broken and discarded. But as more nurses came in, showing her the posts, telling her how her art touched them, Amara began to see herself differently. Maybe she wasn't just the girl who fell down the stairs. Maybe she was something more. That night, as she lay in bed, she stared at her ink-stained fingers. For the first time in a long time, she smiled. She realized that what she thought was only her pain had become her gift. And that gift was not just for her, it was for the world. The first time Amara's name was mentioned by an art gallery in Lagos, she thought it was a mistake. She was just a girl who had been sketching on hospital sheets to survive her pain. But the viral post had reached further than she could imagine. Curators and collectors began to ask about her, hungry to see more of the mysterious young woman whose drawings carried so much raw emotion. When the invitation finally came, Amara almost couldn't believe it. A well-known gallery in Lagos wanted to host her very first exhibition. First, she was nervous. She wondered if people would laugh at her work the way her stepmother used to laugh at her tears. But Obi reminded her, "They won't see weakness in your art, Amara. They'll see strength. They'll see you." With shaky determination, Amara threw herself into painting. Her art became her voice, each canvas telling a story she had once been too afraid to speak out loud. She painted the staircase that broke her body but also the wings that carried her spirit. She painted her loneliness, her silent cries, her fight to stand again. She poured her entire soul into the colors, strokes, and shapes, creating pieces that whispered of pain but shouted of survival. When the day of the exhibition arrived, Lagos was buzzing. The gallery was packed with people, journalists, collectors, students, even strangers who had seen her art online and wanted to witness it with their own eyes. The air was filled with murmurs and gasps as they stood in front of her paintings. Some wiped tears. Others took photos, whispering about how her work felt alive. Amara stood quietly at the corner of the room, her heart racing. For the first time in her life, people weren't looking at her with pity or judgment, they were looking at her with respect. The girl who had once been treated like a servant in her own home now stood in the middle of applause and admiration. One collector approached and offered to buy a painting for thousands of naira. Then another came. Soon, her pieces were selling one after another. Amara could hardly believe it. The same hands that had once scrubbed floors and washed clothes until they bled were now creating art worth more than she had ever dreamed of. That night, as she left the gallery, her heart felt lighter than ever before. She was no longer just Amara, the girl who fell down the stairs. She was Amara, the artist, the survivor, the rising star of Lagos. And deep inside she whispered to herself, "They tried to bury me in darkness, but they didn't know I was a seed." Back in Ibadan, while Amara's name was spreading like fire across Lagos, Titi's world was beginning to collapse. The same woman who once walked proudly through the markets, boasting about her wealth and power, now struggled to keep her business alive. Customers stopped coming. Deals fell apart one after another. Suppliers whispered that she was difficult, arrogant, and cruel. Slowly, the empire she had built on intimidation and lies began to break apart. First, Titi thought it was just bad luck. She blamed her workers, her friends, even the economy. But soon, she noticed something worse. People were no longer afraid of her. Women who once bowed to her presence now walked past without greeting. Friends who used to sit at her table with wide smiles stopped answering her calls. At social gatherings, whispers followed her everywhere. "That's the one who mistreated her husband's daughter," someone would murmur. Another voice would add, "Have you seen the girl now? She's shining in Lagos." Titi's stomach twisted every time she heard Amara's name. The girl she had pushed down the staircase, the one she thought was finished forever, was now on television screens, in magazines, and on social media timelines. Amara's art was everywhere, bright, bold, and celebrated. Each headline felt like a slap across Titi's face. From tragedy to triumph, Amara's rise as Nigeria's new art sensation. Her nights grew restless. She paced the house alone, her business accounts running dry, her so-called friends enjoying parties without her. Even her husband, who had once been silent in her shadow, began to pull away. He no longer looked at her with admiration. Instead, his eyes carried quiet disappointment, as though he finally saw through the mask she had worn for years. Desperation gnawed at Titi. She tried to rebuild, tried to cling to the power slipping from her fingers, but it was useless. Every move she made ended in failure. Every step she took only reminded her of the one person she could never control again, Amara. One afternoon, Titi sat in front of the television, her hands shaking as she flipped through the channels. Then she saw it, a live coverage of Amara's new exhibition in Lagos. Cameras flashed, reporters cheered, and Amara walked gracefully through the crowd, stronger than ever. The girl who once cried at her feet now stood taller than she could ever dream. Titi's chest tightened, her mouth went dry. For the first time in her life she felt small, truly small. She turned off the TV, but the image of Amara's confident smile burned in her mind. The world loved the girl she had tried to destroy, and the more Amara rose, the faster Titi fell. Her power, her wealth, her respect, it was all gone, and she knew, with bitter truth sinking into her bones, that the girl she once mocked as worthless was now everything she could never be. The night of the Grand Art Gala in Lagos felt like a dream to Amara. The gallery was lit with golden lights, cameras flashed non-stop, and the air buzzed with excitement. Important guests from across Nigeria filled the hall, artists, celebrities, business leaders, and admirers who had followed her journey online. Everywhere she looked, her paintings hung proudly on the walls, telling her story of pain, survival, and triumph. Tonight, she was no longer the broken girl from Ibadan. Tonight she was the star. As Amara prepared to walk onto the stage, her heart pounded with a mixture of nerves and joy. She adjusted her elegant gown, its flowing fabric making her look like a queen stepping into her kingdom. The announcer called her name, and the crowd erupted in applause. She stepped forward gracefully, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her back straight, her chin high. But then, in the corner of her eye, she froze. Sitting near the front row were two familiar faces, her father and Titi. The hall seemed to grow silent for a moment as whispers ran through the audience. People knew the story. Many had heard of the stepmother's cruelty and the silent father who had done nothing. Now, here they were, forced to watch the girl they had once broken shine brighter than the stars above them. Titi's face went pale. Her eyes widened, her lips trembling as she saw Amara walk, strong and elegant, across the stage. She had expected to see a weak, broken girl limping through life. Instead, she was faced with a woman transformed, glowing with confidence and power. In that moment, Titi looked small, so small compared to the daughter she had once mocked. Amara's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes followed his daughter, filled with shame. For years, he had been silent, blind to her suffering. Now, the world celebrated the same girl he had failed to protect. The applause that shook the room was a painful reminder of how much he had lost by choosing silence. The audience rose to their feet, clapping louder and louder. Cameras captured every moment, flashing like fireworks as Amara smiled at the crowd. She did not flinch when her gaze met her stepmother's. Instead, she looked at her calmly, almost as if to say, "You didn't win. I did." Whispers spread among the guests. "Isn't that her stepmother? The one who mistreated her?" Another voice added. "Look at her now. God really lifted her higher." Titi lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. For the first time, she tasted the bitterness of powerlessness. Amara stood tall on the stage, her voice steady as she thanked the audience for believing in her. Behind the applause, the image of her father and stepmother sitting in shame was the sweetest proof that her story had come full circle. The hall was silent for a heartbeat as Amara stepped up to the microphone. The lights above her glowed warmly, catching the sparkle of her gown. Behind her hung the largest painting of the night, a staircase breaking into pieces, transforming into wings. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for her to speak. She took a slow breath, her hands steady, her voice clear. "Tonight you see me standing here as an artist. But not long ago, I was just a girl who was told she was worthless. A girl who was pushed down, mocked, and left to suffer in silence." Her words cut through the room like glass. People exchanged glances, cameras flashing rapidly to capture every moment. In the front row, Titi shifted uncomfortably. Sweat gathered on her forehead as whispers moved through the audience. Everyone knew who Amara was talking about. Amara's eyes swept the room, then stopped on her stepmother. Her voice grew stronger. "The woman who tried to break me," she said, her tone calm but powerful, "only taught me how to rise." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. Some people stood to their feet, clapping until their hands stung. Others shouted her name with admiration. Reporters rushed forward, their cameras exploding with light. Amara stood tall, her eyes still locked on Titi, who trembled under the weight of a truth she could no longer hide. Titi's hands shook in her lap. She lowered her head, unable to meet her stepdaughter's gaze. For years she had laughed at Amara's tears, silenced her voice, and treated her like nothing. Now the same girl she once called weak stood before the world, celebrated, honored, and untouchable. Amara's father sat stiffly beside his wife, his eyes moist, his guilt heavy. He could not lift his head either. He knew the world saw his silence as betrayal, and nothing he said could erase the shame. Amara's voice softened, but it carried even more weight. "I stand here not because life was kind to me, but because I refused to stay down. Every push, every insult, every tear only became a brushstroke in the painting of my survival. And tonight I want every young girl listening to know, you are never what they call you. You are what you decide to become." The crowd roared, clapping, cheering, some wiping away tears. Her words were not just for her stepmother, they were for every soul in the room. She had turned her pain into power, her silence into a story that shook the world. Titi sank deeper into her chair, her face pale. She could not run, she could not hide. The truth was laid bare for all to see. And in that moment, Amara smiled, not out of revenge but out of victory. She had finally won. The final night of the exhibition was brighter than any dream Amara ever had. The gallery was full, cameras flashing in every corner, reporters pushing forward, and admirers waiting to catch a glimpse of her. At the center of the hall stood her newest painting, a masterpiece she had named, "The Fall That Made Me Fly." The canvas showed a broken staircase, but at the end of the fall, wings spread wide, lifting a figure higher into the sky. The room grew quiet as people stared at it, many with tears in their eyes. Then, a wealthy collector stepped forward and bought the piece for a staggering price. The crowd erupted, and in seconds, reporters swarmed around Amara. "Amara, how does it feel to be called the voice of resilience in Africa?" one asked. Another added, "What message do you want to give the world through your art?" Microphones stretched toward her as cameras flashed like fireworks. Amara smiled softly, her heart steady. She had been pushed, humiliated, and broken, but tonight she was rising higher than she had ever imagined. She looked into the cameras and spoke with a calm strength. Sometimes the staircase they push you down, she said, her voice carrying through the hall, is the very one that lifts you to a higher floor. The crowd clapped and cheered, some chanting her name, others capturing the moment to share with the world. For Amara, it wasn't just about art anymore. It was about every girl who had been silenced, every child who had been told they were nothing. And as the cameras lit up her smile, the whole world knew, Amara had turned her fall into flight.